Long before Rome became an empire, before its roads crossed Europe and its armies marched beneath red banners, there was only a small settlement beside the Tiber River. The land was not empty. Villages already dotted the hills of central Italy, and different peoples lived among forests, fields, and winding streams. Among them were the Latins, who farmed the fertile plains around the river. The Tiber was important. It provided water, fish, fertile soil, and a natural route toward the sea. But it could also be dangerous. Floods sometimes spread across the lowlands, so people preferred to settle on the higher hills nearby. Among these hills was one that would become famous, the Palatine. According to Roman tradition, the story of Rome began with two brothers, Romulus and Remus. They were said to be descendants of the Trojan hero Aeneas, whose legendary journey had brought his family to Italy. The brothers were abandoned as infants and, according to the famous story, were rescued and raised by a she-wolf. Much of this story belongs to legend rather than confirmed history. Yet the Romans themselves believed these tales were part of their ancient identity. The traditional date for Rome's founding is 753 BC. Whether one man truly founded the city on that exact day is impossible to know. What is clearer is that small communities on the hills beside the Tiber gradually grew together. Over time, settlements became organized, villages became a town, and the town began to develop its own customs and political traditions. Rome had not yet become powerful. It had no vast empire. It had no famous legions. It was simply a young settlement surrounded by rivals. But slowly, almost unnoticed, something extraordinary was beginning. The little community beside the Tiber was becoming Rome. In the centuries after Rome's traditional founding, the little settlement beside the Tiber slowly changed. Rome was no longer just a collection of huts on a few hills. Villages merged, streets appeared, and religious customs began to bind the growing community together. According to Roman tradition, the earliest Rome was ruled by kings. The first was Romulus, the legendary founder. Stories describe him as a warrior who established the city's first institutions and divided its people into different groups. After Romulus came several other kings. Some were remembered as warriors, while others were credited with building temples, organizing religious ceremonies, and creating laws. One of the most famous was Numa Pompilius. Unlike Romulus, Numa was remembered as a peaceful ruler. Roman tradition claimed that he organized many of Rome's religious practices and created priestly offices that would survive for centuries. Another king, Tullus Hostilius, was remembered very differently. He was said to have been a fierce warrior who expanded Roman territory. The Romans also remembered Ancus Marcius, who connected Rome more closely with the Tiber and the nearby coast. Then came a period when Rome was increasingly influenced by the Etruscans, a powerful people living north of the city. Etruscan culture brought new ideas in architecture, religion, engineering, and government. Rome's position near the Tiber made it an attractive place for trade, and its population continued to grow. The final kings of Rome were associated with the powerful Tarquin family. The last king, traditionally known as Tarquinius Superbus, or Tarquin the Proud, was remembered as a harsh ruler who depended heavily on force. Eventually, Roman tradition says the people had enough. The monarchy was overthrown around 509 BC. Rome would never again be ruled by a king. Instead, the Romans created something new, a republic. It would be governed through elected officials, assemblies, and a powerful senate. The young republic was far from peaceful, but it had taken its first great political step. Rome was about to begin the long struggle that would transform it from a small Italian city into one of the greatest powers the ancient world had ever seen. The birth of the Roman Republic. The fall of Rome's monarchy did not suddenly make the city peaceful. Instead, it opened a new chapter filled with uncertainty, rivalry, and struggle. Around 509 BC, the Romans established a republic, a system in which political power was shared among elected officials rather than held by a king. 2 consuls were chosen each year to lead the state, while the Senate became an important center of political influence. But Rome was far from a modern democracy. Much of the power belonged to wealthy families known as patricians. ordinary citizens, called plebeians, had fewer political rights and often struggled with debt and poverty. This division soon created tension. The plebeians formed much of Rome's army, yet they felt that the wealthy controlled almost everything. They wanted protection from unfair treatment and a greater voice in government. According to Roman tradition, their anger eventually led to a dramatic protest. Large numbers of plebeians left the city and gathered outside Rome, refusing to continue their normal duties until their demands were addressed. The patricians could not easily ignore them. Rome needed its farmers, workers, and soldiers. A compromise was eventually reached. The plebeians gained representatives known as tribunes, officials whose role was to protect their interests. It was an important beginning. Rome's political system would continue to change through centuries of conflict between different social groups. Meanwhile, the young republic faced another problem. Its neighbors were watching. Rome was surrounded by rival communities, and some were willing to fight for control of the fertile lands of central Italy. The republic therefore had to defend itself while also trying to expand. Its soldiers became more organized. Its political institutions became stronger. And every victory brought new territory, new enemies, and new opportunities. Rome was still only one city, but the Republic had discovered something that would become one of its greatest strengths. It could survive internal conflict without completely breaking apart. And soon, Rome would begin its long conquest of Italy. The struggle of the orders. Rome was growing, but inside the city, another battle was taking shape. The conflict was not between foreign armies. It was between Romans themselves. The wealthy patricians controlled many important offices and much of the land. The plebeians, who made up most of the population, carried much of the burden of farming, trade, taxes, and military service. For years, ordinary citizens demanded greater protection and a larger role in government. One of their greatest victories came with the creation of the 12 Tables. Around the middle of the 5th century BC, Roman laws were written down and displayed publicly. Before this, knowledge of the law had been controlled largely by powerful families. Now, ordinary citizens could at least see the rules that governed them. But the struggle continued. Plebeians gradually gained the right to hold more political offices. Eventually, laws allowed marriages between patricians and plebeians and opened the highest offices of the Republic to wealthy members of both groups. Rome was changing. At the same time, its armies were becoming more experienced. The Romans fought neighboring peoples such as the Equi, Volsci, and Etruscans. These wars were often difficult. Soldiers sometimes spent years away from their farms, and Rome itself occasionally faced serious danger. Then, in the early 4th century BC, disaster arrived. A group of Celtic warriors known as Gauls invaded Italy and defeated the Roman army. They marched into Rome. The city was captured and burned in one of the most humiliating moments of early Roman history. Yet Rome survived. The destruction taught the Romans a harsh lesson. Their city could fall and their enemies could reach its heart. But instead of abandoning their ambitions, the Romans rebuilt. Their walls became stronger, their armies became more disciplined, and their determination grew. The little republic had suffered its first great catastrophe. It would not be the last. But Rome was learning how to turn defeat into strength. The conquest of Italy. After the destruction caused by the Gallic invasion, Rome slowly rebuilt itself. The Romans had learned that survival depended on more than courage. They needed stronger armies, better alliances, and control over the lands surrounding their city. During the 4th and early 3rd centuries BC, Rome began a long series of wars across the Italian peninsula. One of its greatest challenges came from the Samnites, a powerful people living in the mountains of central and southern Italy. The Samnite Wars lasted for decades. Rome suffered defeats, but it continued fighting. Roman armies gradually became more experienced, and Rome learned how to recover from setbacks. The Romans also understood the value of alliances. Instead of destroying every defeated community, Rome often offered different forms of citizenship and political partnership. Some communities became Roman allies while keeping parts of their own local government. This created a growing network of peoples connected to Rome. But one final major opponent remained in southern Italy. The Greek cities there were wealthy and had strong military traditions. One of their most famous allies was King Pyrrhus of Epirus, who crossed into Italy with an army that included war elephants. The Romans faced him in several battles. Pyrrhus won some of these encounters, but his victories came at an enormous cost. According to tradition, after one particularly costly battle, he looked at the losses suffered by his army and realized that another victory like that could destroy him. This gave rise to the expression Pyrrhic victory. Eventually, Pyrrhus withdrew from Italy. Rome had won. By around 272 BC, the Romans had extended their influence across almost the entire Italian peninsula. The small city beside the Tiber had become the dominant power in Italy. But Rome's expansion created a new problem. Beyond Italy lay the Western Mediterranean, where another great power controlled wealthy cities, trade routes, and powerful fleets. Its name was Carthage. Soon, Rome and Carthage would meet, and their struggle would decide who would dominate the Mediterranean world. The First Punic War. By the 3rd century BC, Rome controlled much of Italy, but it had entered a much larger world. Across the Mediterranean stood Carthage, a wealthy North African city with powerful colonies, merchants, and one of the strongest naval forces of the ancient world. At first, Rome and Carthage were not necessarily destined to become enemies. They had traded with one another and had even made agreements in earlier centuries. But Rome's growing power brought it into conflict with Carthaginian interests in Sicily. The crisis began around the city of Messana. Rome became involved in a complicated struggle between local forces, and Carthage soon intervened as well. What began as a regional dispute became something far greater. In 264 BC, the First Punic War began. Rome had one major weakness. It was a land power. Carthage was a naval power. The Romans therefore had to learn how to fight at sea. They built fleets and trained sailors. According to later Roman accounts, they even developed a boarding device called the corvus, allowing Roman soldiers to turn naval battles into something closer to fighting on land. The war lasted more than 20 years. Both sides suffered enormous losses. Rome experienced defeats, storms destroyed fleets, and thousands of soldiers and sailors died. Yet Rome refused to give up. Eventually, in 241 BC, a final major naval battle near the Egadian Islands broke Carthage's ability to continue the war. Carthage sued for peace. Rome had won. Sicily became Rome's first major overseas province. But the victory came at a price. Rome had discovered that controlling territory outside Italy required permanent military commitments, taxation, administration, and fleets. The Republic was no longer simply an Italian power. It was becoming a Mediterranean power. And Carthage had not disappeared. People remembered their defeat. A new generation would rise there, including one of the most famous commanders in ancient history. His name was Hannibal, and before long, he would bring the war directly to Italy. Hannibal crosses the Alps. After the First Punic War, Rome had become stronger, but Carthage was not finished. In Carthage, a young commander named Hannibal Barca was preparing for a new struggle. He had grown up in a military family and deeply understood the rivalry between Rome and Carthage. In 218 BC, Hannibal made a decision that shocked the ancient world. Instead of attacking Rome by sea, he would march overland through Spain, cross southern Gaul, and enter Italy from the north. His army was enormous. It included soldiers from different peoples, cavalry, supplies, and even war elephants. The journey was brutal. The army crossed rivers, climbed steep mountain paths, and faced hostile tribes. Then came the Alps. Snow covered the mountains. The paths were narrow and dangerous. Men and animals slipped from the cliffs, while attacks from local tribes made the journey even harder. Yet Hannibal continued. When his army finally emerged into northern Italy, it had suffered terrible losses. But it was still strong enough to fight. Rome quickly realized that a serious threat had arrived. Hannibal won several early battles, including the famous battles of Trebia and Lake Trasimene. Then came Cannae in 216 BC. The Roman army was enormous, but Hannibal used clever tactics to surround it. The result was one of Rome's worst military disasters. Thousands of Romans were killed, For a moment, it seemed possible that Rome itself might fall. But Hannibal had a problem. He had defeated Roman armies, yet he had not captured Rome. The Romans refused to surrender. Instead, they changed their strategy. They avoided giving Hannibal another easy opportunity for a decisive battle and began attacking Carthaginian allies and territories elsewhere. The war became a test of endurance. Rome had suffered terrible losses, but its population, resources, and determination were enormous. The struggle would continue for years, and eventually the Romans would take the war back across the Mediterranean, toward Carthage itself. Hannibal's army had crossed the Alps, but the hardest part of the journey was not yet over. Thousands of soldiers were exhausted, many had been wounded, and some of the war elephants had died along the dangerous mountain paths. Yet Hannibal did not stop. He descended into northern Italy and entered a land Rome considered its own. The Romans were shocked. They had expected Carthage to attack from the sea or through Sicily. Instead, Hannibal had appeared from the mountains with an army that seemed to have come from nowhere. Rome quickly sent an army to confront him. The first major clash came near the Ticinus River. Hannibal used his cavalry with great skill, surrounding and attacking the Roman horsemen. The Romans were forced to retreat. Soon afterward, another battle took place near the Trebia River. The Roman army was larger, but Hannibal understood that numbers were not everything. He studied the Roman commanders, the cold winter weather, and the frozen river. Before the battle, Hannibal secretly placed a group of soldiers in hiding. Then he deliberately provoked the Romans into crossing the freezing river. The Roman soldiers entered the water, already exhausted and suffering from the cold. Once they reached the other side, Hannibal's army attacked. His cavalry struck from the sides while the hidden soldiers emerged from behind. The Roman army collapsed. It was Hannibal's first great victory in Italy. But Rome did not surrender. Instead, the Romans raised more armies. They were beginning to understand something terrifying. Hannibal was not simply a foreign commander who had invaded Italy. He was a military genius who seemed to understand exactly how Roman armies thought and fought. And Rome was now facing a war that would last for years. After the victory at the Trebia River, Hannibal continued deeper into Italy. His army was smaller than the armies Rome could raise, but Hannibal had one advantage the Romans could not easily replace: experience. His soldiers had fought beside him for years. They trusted his decisions, even when those decisions seemed dangerous. In the spring of 217 BC, Hannibal crossed the Apennine Mountains and moved toward central Italy. The Roman consul Gaius Flaminius was determined to stop him. Hannibal knew the Roman commander would follow, so he chose a dangerous route beside Lake Trasimene. The landscape was perfect for an ambush. On one side stood steep hills. On the other was the lake. A narrow road passed between them. Hannibal positioned his troops across the surrounding hills and waited. The Roman army entered the valley without realizing what was waiting above them. Then, at the right moment, Hannibal gave the order. The hills suddenly came alive. Carthaginian soldiers rushed down upon the Romans from several directions. The Roman army had almost no room to form its usual battle lines. Confusion spread. Some soldiers tried to escape toward the lake, while others desperately climbed the hills. Many were trapped. The Battle of Lake Trasimene became one of the largest and most successful ambushes of the ancient world. Thousands of Roman soldiers were killed or captured. Once again, Rome had suffered a terrible defeat. But Hannibal made a surprising decision. He did not march directly toward Rome. Instead, he continued moving through Italy, hoping that Rome's allies would abandon the city and join him. For Hannibal, the war was not simply about defeating Roman armies. It was about breaking Rome's political power. But Rome had survived disasters before, and instead of surrendering, the Romans prepared to change their strategy. They would soon choose a commander who understood that fighting Hannibal directly might be exactly what Hannibal wanted. Rome was frightened, but it was not broken. After the disaster at Lake Trasimene, the Romans appointed Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator. Unlike the commanders who had rushed directly into battle, Fabius believed that Hannibal should not be given the kind of fight he wanted. His strategy was simple. Do not attack. Follow Hannibal. Watch him. Cut off his supplies. Force him to spend time and resources. Hannibal wanted a decisive victory, but Fabius refused to give him one. The Romans began calling Fabius the delayer because he avoided major battles. Many Romans hated the strategy. They wanted revenge. They wanted Hannibal destroyed immediately. But Fabius understood that Rome had something Carthage did not have in the same way: enormous reserves of manpower. Rome could lose an army and raise another. Hannibal could not replace his veteran soldiers so easily. For months, the two sides moved through Italy without a final confrontation. Then Hannibal captured a large amount of Roman grain and supplies at the town of Geronium. Fabius continued to avoid a direct battle. But political pressure inside Rome was growing. Many Romans believed Fabius was being too cautious. They wanted a commander who would finally confront Hannibal in the open field. Eventually, Rome raised one of the largest armies it had ever assembled. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were prepared to face Hannibal. The Romans believed that overwhelming numbers would finally end the invasion. But Hannibal was waiting. He knew the Romans were coming, and he had already begun preparing one of the most famous battlefield traps in ancient history. The place was called Cannae. There, Hannibal would attempt to destroy an army far larger than his own. And the world would soon learn just how dangerous his strategy could be. In 216 BC, the Roman army marched toward Cannae. It was enormous, far larger than Hannibal's force. Rome believed that sheer numbers would finally crush the Carthaginian army. The Roman commanders, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro, disagreed about how to fight. But eventually, the Romans formed their massive army and prepared for battle. Hannibal studied the Roman formation carefully. He knew he could not simply push against such a large force, so he created a plan. His infantry would form a curved line, with the center deliberately positioned farther forward. His strongest African soldiers waited on the sides, hidden behind the weaker-looking center. When the Romans attacked, Hannibal's center slowly gave way. The Romans believed they were winning. They pushed forward. More and more Roman soldiers crowded into the center, trying to destroy Hannibal's retreating troops. But this was exactly what Hannibal wanted. As the Roman army moved deeper into the Carthaginian formation, Hannibal's African infantry suddenly attacked from both sides. Then his cavalry struck from behind. The Romans were surrounded. There was almost nowhere to escape. Thousands of soldiers were packed together, unable to use their weapons effectively. The battlefield became chaos. The Roman army was trapped inside a tightening circle of Carthaginian soldiers. By the end of the battle, tens of thousands of Romans were dead. Cannae became one of the greatest military victories of the ancient world. Rome had suffered a catastrophe. For a moment, it seemed possible that Hannibal might actually destroy the Roman Republic. But once again, Hannibal faced a difficult decision. Should he march directly toward Rome? Or should he wait and allow Rome's allies to abandon the Republic? His officers urged him to move quickly, but Hannibal chose not to attack Rome immediately. That decision would become one of the most debated moments in military history. Rome had been badly wounded, but it was still alive. After Cannae, Rome seemed closer to disaster than ever before. News of the defeat spread across Italy. Thousands of Roman soldiers had been killed, and many communities began wondering whether Rome could still protect them. Some of Rome's allies changed sides. The southern Italian city of Capua, one of the most important cities in the region, joined Hannibal. For Carthage, this looked like the beginning of victory, but Rome refused to surrender. The Senate continued to raise armies. Young men were recruited. Older men were called back into service. Even prisoners were offered freedom if they agreed to fight. Rome understood that Hannibal could defeat armies, but perhaps he could not defeat Rome itself. Hannibal remained in Italy, moving from one region to another. He captured towns, gathered supplies, and tried to convince more Roman allies to join him. Yet something was missing. Carthage did not send enough soldiers or supplies to support him. Hannibal had won enormous victories, but his army was slowly being worn down. Meanwhile, Rome changed its strategy. Instead of searching for another Cannae, Roman commanders avoided major battles whenever possible. They attacked Hannibal's allies. They captured towns. They destroyed food supplies. They slowly surrounded the territories that had joined Carthage. The war became a struggle of endurance. Hannibal needed a decisive political collapse. Rome only needed to survive. Years passed. Then the Romans began taking the war beyond Italy. They attacked Carthaginian interests in Spain, where Hannibal's family had built a powerful base. A young Roman commander named Publius Cornelius Scipio emerged there. Scipio was intelligent, ambitious, and determined to defeat Carthage using its own methods. Eventually, he would take the war directly to North Africa, and Hannibal, after years of fighting in Italy, would be forced to leave the land where he had won his greatest victories. The final confrontation between Hannibal and Rome was beginning to take shape. While Hannibal remained in Italy, the war was changing in Spain. Spain was extremely important to Carthage. It provided soldiers, wealth, and resources for the war against Rome. Hannibal's family had built a powerful Carthaginian presence there, and Rome knew that destroying it could weaken Hannibal himself. A young Roman commander named Publius Cornelius Scipio took control of the Roman campaign in Spain. Scipio was not reckless. He studied Carthaginian movements and waited for the right opportunity. In 209 BC, he attacked New Carthage, the most important Carthaginian city in Spain. The city seemed difficult to capture. It was protected by walls and surrounded partly by water. But Scipio discovered that the lagoon beside the city became shallow at certain times. His soldiers crossed through the water and attacked from an unexpected direction. The defenders were caught by surprise. New Carthage fell. The victory gave Rome weapons, supplies, prisoners, and valuable information about Carthage. More importantly, it destroyed one of Carthage's strongest bases. Scipio continued his campaign. He defeated Carthaginian armies and gradually pushed them out of Spain. By 206 BC, Rome had effectively destroyed Carthage's power there. Meanwhile, Hannibal was still in Italy. He had spent more than a decade fighting far from his homeland. His army was no longer as strong as it had been at Cannae. His victories had become harder to achieve. Then came the news he had feared. Scipio had invaded North Africa. Carthage itself was now threatened. The Carthaginian government recalled Hannibal. After years of fighting in Italy, Hannibal finally left the land where he had become famous. He returned to Africa to defend his homeland. But waiting for him was the Roman commander who had learned from Hannibal's own victories. Scipio was ready. The two greatest commanders of the Second Punic War were finally moving toward each other. Their meeting would decide the fate of Carthage. Hannibal returned to North Africa in 203 BC. He had spent years fighting Rome in Italy, but now the war had reached his homeland. Carthage was desperate. Scipio had already defeated several Carthaginian forces and was threatening the city itself. Hannibal understood that he needed to stop the Romans before they became too powerful. The two sides eventually agreed to meet near Zama. Before the battle, Hannibal and Scipio met face to face. Hannibal tried to negotiate. He understood how dangerous the situation had become, but Scipio believed Rome had the advantage. The negotiations failed. The armies prepared for battle. Hannibal still had a powerful force, including war elephants. He hoped the elephants could break the Roman lines and create confusion. But Scipio had studied Hannibal carefully. He ordered his soldiers to create lanes between their formations. When the elephants charged, Roman soldiers made noise and opened passages, allowing many of the animals to pass through without causing the destruction Hannibal expected. Then the Roman cavalry attacked. The battle became intense. Hannibal's veteran soldiers fought fiercely. For years, they had followed him through Italy and survived countless battles. But the Romans were prepared. Scipio's cavalry eventually returned to the battlefield and attacked Hannibal's army from behind. Surrounded once again, the Carthaginian forces began to collapse. Hannibal was defeated. The man who had terrified Rome for more than a decade had finally lost the war. Carthage was forced to accept harsh peace terms. It lost much of its military power and was forbidden from fighting another war without Roman permission. Rome had survived its greatest enemy. Scipio returned to Rome as a hero and received the name Africanus. Hannibal, meanwhile, remained an important figure in Carthage for a time. But his story was not finished. Even after losing the war, Hannibal would continue to challenge Rome in a different way. His greatest weapon was no longer an army. It was his political influence. After the defeat at Zama, Hannibal returned to Carthage. The city was no longer the powerful rival it had once been. Its army had been destroyed, its territories were reduced, and Rome watched its every move. But Hannibal did not disappear. Instead, he entered politics. He became a leader in Carthage and tried to rebuild the city from within. Hannibal understood that Carthage could not defeat Rome on the battlefield anymore. So he focused on something different: money and government. He discovered that corruption had weakened Carthage almost as much as the war had. Hannibal introduced financial reforms and tried to make the government more responsible. He wanted Carthage to become wealthy and stable again without depending on another war. For a time, his reforms worked, but his popularity frightened his political enemies. Some powerful Carthaginians feared that Hannibal might become too influential. They secretly sent information about him to Rome. The Romans already distrusted him. To them, Hannibal was the man who had crossed the Alps and nearly destroyed the Republic. They wanted him gone. When Hannibal learned that Rome was demanding his arrest, he escaped from Carthage. He began a long journey into exile. Eventually, he found refuge with Antiochus III, the king of the Seleucid Empire. Hannibal offered his knowledge and experience to another ruler who was preparing to challenge Rome. But history had changed. Rome was no longer the inexperienced power Hannibal had fought in Italy. It had become stronger, richer, and more confident. Hannibal could still give advice, but he could not recreate the army that had once followed him across the Alps. The Romans continued to pursue him politically. Wherever Hannibal went, Rome watched. The great Carthaginian commander had become a wandering exile. Yet even in old age, Rome still feared his name. And eventually, Hannibal would have to make one final decision about his fate. Hannibal spent his final years moving from one foreign court to another. After leaving Carthage, he found protection with Antiochus III, the powerful king of the Seleucid Empire. Hannibal advised the king about Rome. He believed that Rome could still be defeated if its enemies acted carefully and fought together. But Antiochus did not always follow Hannibal's advice. The Romans eventually went to war with the Seleucid Empire. Hannibal wanted a major role in the conflict, but the king did not fully trust him. The Seleucid forces were defeated, and Hannibal was once again forced to flee. He traveled through the eastern Mediterranean, searching for somewhere safe. Eventually, he found refuge in Bithynia, where he served King Prusias. Even there, however, Rome continued to watch him. The Romans knew that Hannibal was old, but they still considered him dangerous. To them, he was not simply a defeated enemy. He was a symbol of what Rome had once feared most. Hannibal understood that his enemies would never stop searching for him. According to ancient accounts, when Roman agents finally demanded that the Bithynian king surrender him, Hannibal realized that his escape was over. He had spent much of his life fighting Rome. He had crossed mountains, defeated enormous armies, survived betrayal, exile, and political struggles. But he could not escape Rome forever. Hannibal chose to end his own life rather than be captured. He died in exile, far from Carthage and far from the battlefield where he had become famous. The exact details of his final moments are uncertain, because ancient writers told different versions of the story. But one thing is clear: Hannibal Barca had changed the history of warfare. He had defeated Roman armies again and again. He had crossed the Alps with elephants. He had created some of the most brilliant battlefield tactics the ancient world had ever seen. And even though he lost the war, Rome never forgot him. Centuries later, his name would still be remembered as one of history's greatest military commanders. Hannibal was gone, but the war he had fought changed Rome forever. The Second Punic War had shown the Romans that even their greatest armies could be destroyed. At Cannae, Rome had lost tens of thousands of soldiers in a single day. Yet, instead of collapsing, the Republic became more determined. This was one of Rome's greatest strengths. Rome could replace soldiers, could rebuild armies, could survive defeat. Carthage could not match that endurance. After the war, Rome continued expanding across the Mediterranean. The Republic had learned valuable lessons from Hannibal. Roman commanders became more cautious. Their armies became more experienced. Their political leaders understood that future enemies might use unexpected strategies. Rome also gained control over territories that had once belonged to Carthage. Spain became increasingly important to Roman power. Roman influence spread across the western Mediterranean, and eventually Rome began looking toward the eastern Mediterranean as well. Carthage, meanwhile, tried to rebuild its economy. Without a large army, it focused on trade and agriculture. Surprisingly, the city recovered faster than Rome expected. Its markets became busy again. Its fields produced wealth. Its population began to prosper. This worried the Romans. Some Roman politicians believed that Carthage would eventually become powerful enough to threaten Rome again. Among them was Cato the Elder. Whenever he spoke in the Roman Senate about foreign policy, he repeatedly warned that Carthage remained dangerous. His speeches became famous for ending with the same message: Carthage must be destroyed. For years, the warning was repeated. Then, in 149 BC, Rome finally found a reason to act. A new war began. It would become known as the Third Punic War. This time, however, Rome was not fighting the Carthage that Hannibal had once commanded. The city was weaker, its army was limited, and Rome was more powerful than ever. But the people of Carthage were not ready to surrender quietly. They prepared for one final struggle. In 149 BC, the Third Punic War began. Rome sent an army to North Africa, expecting Carthage to surrender quickly. At first, the Carthaginians tried to avoid complete destruction. They agreed to Roman demands and handed over weapons. But then Rome made another demand. The Carthaginians were ordered to abandon their city and move far away from the coast. For the people of Carthage, this was impossible to accept. Their city was their home. Their history was there. Their ancestors were buried there. They realized that Rome did not simply want their army. Rome wanted Carthage itself destroyed. The people closed the gates. The war began again. Inside the city, everything was transformed for defense. Workshops produced weapons day and night. Metal was collected. Women cut their hair to provide material for ropes. Even temples and private homes were used to support the war effort. The Carthaginians had almost no time, but they prepared with incredible determination. The Roman army surrounded the city, yet Carthage resisted. For years, Rome had fought Hannibal and learned how difficult Carthage could be. Now Rome faced a city that had nothing left to lose. The siege became long and brutal. Roman soldiers struggled to break through the defenses. The Carthaginians launched attacks from behind their walls and destroyed Roman equipment. But Rome had enormous resources. More soldiers arrived. More supplies arrived. Slowly, the Romans tightened their grip. Eventually, a young Roman commander named Scipio Africanus took control of the siege. He understood that the city could not be defeated quickly, so he built a blockade around Carthage. Food became scarce. Disease spread. The people became weaker. Still, they refused to surrender. After years of resistance, the final battle was approaching. The city that had once produced Hannibal was about to face its last days, and Rome was determined to make sure that Carthage would never rise again. By 146 BC, Carthage was exhausted. The Roman blockade had cut the city off from food and supplies. Inside the walls, hunger had become a daily struggle, but the defenders continued fighting. Scipio Africanus understood that the city would not surrender voluntarily. The Romans began their final assault. They broke through the outer defenses and entered the streets of Carthage. The fighting became chaotic. Roman soldiers moved from house to house while Carthaginian defenders fought from rooftops and narrow streets. Every part of the city became a battlefield. Some Carthaginians retreated toward the citadel of Bursa, the highest and strongest part of the city. There, the last defenders made their final stand. They knew there was little hope. Still, they continued fighting. Eventually, resistance collapsed. The Romans captured the city. Ancient accounts describe scenes of destruction, fire, and enormous suffering. For days, Carthage burned. Its buildings were destroyed, its population was killed or enslaved, and the city that had once rivaled Rome was finished. The Third Punic War was over. Carthage no longer existed as an independent power. Rome had won completely. The destruction of Carthage marked the end of a rivalry that had lasted for generations. It had begun with competition for trade and territory. It had grown into 3 enormous wars. And at the center of the greatest of those wars stood one man, Hannibal Barca. He had crossed the Alps. He had defeated Roman armies at Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and Cannae. He had terrified the Roman Republic. But Rome had survived him, and Rome had learned from every defeat. The fall of Carthage left Rome as the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean. Yet the story of Hannibal was not simply a story about losing. His victories became lessons studied by commanders for centuries. His double envelopment at Cannae became one of the most famous military maneuvers in history. His name became almost legendary. Rome had destroyed Carthage, but it could never destroy the memory of Hannibal. The destruction of Carthage changed the Mediterranean world. Rome now stood almost unchallenged in the Western Mediterranean. Its armies had defeated one of the greatest powers of the ancient world, and its influence continued to expand. But the story of Hannibal remained important. Roman writers remembered him as one of their most dangerous enemies. Later military commanders studied his battles and tried to understand how he had repeatedly defeated larger Roman armies. The Battle of Cannae became especially famous. Hannibal had understood something that many commanders failed to recognize. An army did not always need to be stronger everywhere. It only needed to be stronger at the right moment. He allowed the Roman center to advance while his stronger troops surrounded it from the sides. Then his cavalry closed the final escape route. The Romans had more soldiers. Hannibal had the better position. That lesson would survive long after the Roman Republic itself disappeared. But Hannibal's greatest achievement may have been psychological. Before him, Rome had rarely faced an enemy who could repeatedly defeat its armies on Italian soil. Hannibal proved that Rome could bleed. He showed Rome's enemies that its armies were not invincible. Yet he also revealed Rome's greatest strength. Rome could endure. After Cannae, many states might have surrendered. Rome did not. It continued fighting until Carthage was exhausted. This became one of the defining characteristics of Roman power. The Romans could lose battles and still continue the war. Hannibal could win battles, but he could not force Rome to surrender. That difference ultimately decided the Second Punic War. Still, history remembers Hannibal not as an ordinary defeated general, but as a commander whose victories became legendary. His journey across the Alps, his victories in Italy, and his tactics at Cannae remain part of military history. Carthage was destroyed. Rome became stronger, and Hannibal's name survived for more than 2,000 years. His war was over, but his legend had only begun. Long after Hannibal's death, historians continued to study his life. The ancient world had produced many powerful generals, but few had achieved what Hannibal did. He had taken an army across one of the most difficult mountain ranges in Europe and brought the war directly into Roman territory. He had defeated armies much larger than his own. He had understood terrain, weather, timing, and human psychology. Most importantly, he understood the Roman way of fighting. At Trebia, he used the freezing river and hidden troops. At Lake Trasimene, he transformed the landscape into a giant trap. At Cannae, he created a battlefield surrounded on every side. Each victory showed a different part of his military genius. But Hannibal also had weaknesses. He depended heavily on allies and local resources. His army was far from Carthage. He could defeat Roman armies, but replacing his losses was difficult. And without enough support from Carthage, his victories could not become a final victory. This became the tragedy of Hannibal's campaign. He had the ability to win battles, but winning battles was not enough. Rome had to be forced to surrender, and Rome refused. The Roman Republic learned from its mistakes. Its commanders became more patient. Its armies became more experienced. Instead of giving Hannibal the decisive battles he wanted, Rome gradually weakened his position. Then Rome attacked Carthage's power in Spain. Eventually, the war returned to Africa. Scipio Africanus defeated Hannibal at Zama. The great commander who had once seemed unstoppable was finally defeated. Yet even his defeat became part of his legend. Generations later, military leaders would still study the campaign. They would ask the same question: how could one man lead an army across the Alps and bring Rome so close to destruction? The answer was not simply courage. It was preparation, intelligence, discipline, and an extraordinary understanding of war. Hannibal Barca had lost the war, but in the history of military strategy, his name remained victorious. As centuries passed, the world that Hannibal knew slowly disappeared. Carthage was gone. The Roman Republic eventually became the Roman Empire. New kings and emperors appeared. New armies marched across Europe, Africa, and Asia. Yet the story of Hannibal continued to survive. Roman historians wrote about him with a mixture of fear and admiration. They remembered the years when Rome had seemed close to destruction. For Roman children, Hannibal became a warning about how dangerous a determined enemy could be. For military commanders, he became something different. He became a teacher. His battles were studied because they demonstrated how a smaller army could defeat a larger one through planning and positioning. The idea became especially famous after Cannae. The maneuver Hannibal used there, drawing an enemy forward before surrounding it, became known as a double envelopment. Centuries later, generals would attempt to recreate the same basic idea. But Hannibal's story was about more than tactics. He understood the importance of morale. His soldiers came from many different peoples and cultures. They included North Africans, Iberians, Gauls, and others. Yet Hannibal managed to keep them fighting together for years. That required leadership. He shared hardships with his soldiers. He traveled with them through dangerous terrain. He remained with them during long campaigns far from home. This created a powerful bond between commander and army. Still, Hannibal's life also showed the limits of genius. No commander, however brilliant, can control everything. Politics mattered. Supplies mattered. Reinforcements mattered. Time mattered. Hannibal could defeat Rome's armies, but he could not control the decisions of Carthage. And Rome's greatest weapon was its ability to continue fighting. In the end, Hannibal's campaign became one of history's greatest examples of tactical brilliance without strategic victory. He won extraordinary battles. Rome won the war. That contrast is what makes his story so fascinating. The mountains, the elephants, the battles, and the final defeat all became part of a legend that would survive long after both Hannibal and the Roman Republic were gone. The memory of Hannibal continued to travel through history. As Rome expanded, its writers preserved stories about the great Carthaginian commander. Some described him as ruthless and terrifying. Others admired his intelligence and courage. The truth was probably more complicated. Hannibal was a product of his time. He had been raised in a world where Rome and Carthage were competing for power across the Mediterranean. From childhood, he understood that conflict between the two states was almost unavoidable. His father, Hannibal Barca, had fought Rome during the First Punic War. After that war, Hannibal built Carthaginian influence in Spain. There, Hannibal learned how to command soldiers and manage a growing army. When he became commander, he inherited not only an army, but also his family's struggle against Rome. His decision to cross the Alps was extraordinary. The journey was dangerous even for experienced travelers. Snow, narrow paths, landslides, hostile tribes, and freezing temperatures threatened the army. Yet Hannibal continued. When he finally reached Italy, Rome was caught completely off guard. For years, he remained there. He fought battles. He captured territory. He gained allies. He survived Roman attempts to destroy him, But Italy never became completely Hannibal's. Many Italian communities remained loyal to Rome. This was crucial. Hannibal needed Rome's political system to collapse. Instead, Rome slowly recovered. The longer the war continued, the more difficult Hannibal's position became. Eventually, Rome brought the war to Africa. That forced Hannibal to return home. At Zama, his incredible journey reached its end. He lost the battle. Carthage lost the war. But Hannibal's reputation survived. Even today, his name is associated with military genius, daring strategy, and extraordinary determination. His story reminds us that history is not always decided by who wins the most battles. Sometimes it is decided by who can survive the longest. And Rome proved that it could survive almost anything. After the Second Punic War, Rome's rise became almost unstoppable. The defeat of Carthage removed its greatest rival in the Western Mediterranean. Rome now had greater access to trade routes, territories, and wealth. But Rome did not stop. Its armies moved into new regions, and its political influence continued spreading. Meanwhile, the memory of Hannibal remained part of Roman culture. The Romans had experienced firsthand how dangerous a brilliant enemy could be. His victories became lessons. His mistakes became warnings. And his name became a symbol of the kind of threat Rome could never afford to underestimate. Yet Hannibal himself had wanted something very different. He had not simply wanted to destroy Rome. He wanted Carthage to remain a powerful and independent state. He believed Carthage could compete with Rome if it remained united and economically strong. After the war, he tried to rebuild his homeland through politics. But Rome's influence over Carthage was too strong. Eventually, even a weakened Carthage became unacceptable to Roman leaders. The destruction of the city in 146 BC ended the long rivalry. But Rome inherited more than Carthaginian territory. It inherited a Mediterranean world that was increasingly connected to Roman power. The Republic continued expanding into Greece, Asia Minor, North Africa, and beyond. The victories that had begun with the defeat of Carthage helped create the foundations of Roman dominance. Centuries later, the Roman Empire would control enormous territories around the Mediterranean. But none of that was guaranteed when Hannibal first crossed the Alps. At that moment, Rome was facing a crisis. Its armies were being destroyed. Its allies were wavering. Its enemies believed victory was possible. Hannibal had brought Rome closer to destruction than almost anyone before or after him. Yet Rome survived. That is perhaps the most remarkable part of his story. Hannibal demonstrated what one extraordinary commander could accomplish. Rome demonstrated what an entire state could endure. Their struggle became one of the defining conflicts of the ancient world. And even after Carthage disappeared, the legend of the man who crossed the Alps remained. The story of Hannibal eventually became larger than the man himself. Ancient writers passed his story from one generation to another, and later historians continued to examine his campaigns. Some details were probably exaggerated over time. The exact number of soldiers who crossed the Alps with Hannibal is uncertain. The number of elephants that survived is also debated. But the central story is clear. A Carthaginian commander took an army across mountains that many considered almost impossible to cross. He entered Italy unexpectedly. He defeated Roman armies again and again. And for years, he remained one of the greatest threats Rome had ever faced. His success came from understanding his enemies. Hannibal did not simply ask how many soldiers Rome had. He asked how those soldiers would behave. He studied Roman commanders. He studied the land. He used weather, rivers, hills, forests, and narrow valleys as weapons. At Cannae, he transformed the movement of the Roman army into part of his own plan. At Trasimene, the landscape itself became a trap. This way of thinking made Hannibal different from many commanders of his age. He was not simply strong. He was adaptable. But Hannibal's story also contains an important lesson about patience. Rome learned that it did not need to defeat Hannibal in one great battle. Could wait, could replace losses, could attack his allies, could slowly reduce his resources. That strategy eventually worked. When Hannibal returned to Africa, he was still dangerous. but the balance had changed. Scipio had learned from Hannibal. The Roman army had become more experienced. Carthage was weaker. At Zama, the result was decisive. Hannibal lost the war he had spent his entire life fighting. Yet his defeat did not erase his achievements. The Roman Republic had survived its greatest military crisis, but it had also been transformed by it. Rome had learned how to fight longer wars, command larger armies, and project power far beyond Italy. The victory over Hannibal became one of the foundations of Rome's future, and that future would eventually reshape the entire Mediterranean world. Years after the fall of Carthage, Rome continued its expansion across the Mediterranean. The Republic had become more confident, but it had also become more powerful. Roman armies were now fighting in distant lands, far beyond the Italian peninsula. The lessons of the Punic Wars remained important. Rome had learned that victory required more than battlefield courage. It required money, supplies, allies, roads, ships, and the ability to replace soldiers. These were advantages Hannibal could never fully overcome. His greatest victories had depended on speed, surprise, and superior battlefield decisions. But Rome had something different. It had endurance. The Roman Republic could suffer enormous losses and still continue fighting. This was why Hannibal's victories never became a final victory. After Cannae, Rome refused to negotiate. After years of defeats, Rome continued raising armies. After losing important allies, Rome rebuilt its alliances. Eventually, it took the war to Carthage itself. This changed the balance completely. Hannibal had spent years fighting on Roman soil. Now Rome was fighting in North Africa. The psychological effect was enormous. Carthage was forced to recall its greatest commander. Hannibal returned home, but the circumstances were completely different from those of his arrival in Italy. He no longer commanded the same veteran army. He no longer had the same freedom. And Rome had a new commander who had learned from his methods. Scipio Africanus understood that defeating Hannibal required preparation and discipline. At Zama, he used cavalry, infantry, and careful battlefield organization to overcome Hannibal's army. The victory ended the Second Punic War, but it also created a new Roman confidence. Rome had faced the greatest military threat in its history and survived. From that moment forward, Roman leaders increasingly believed that their republic could dominate the Mediterranean. The shadow of Hannibal remained, but Rome was no longer the frightened city he had attacked years earlier. It had become the rising superpower of the ancient world. The rise of Rome after the Punic Wars was not simply the result of military victories. Rome had developed a system that allowed it to recover from disasters that might have destroyed another state. Its citizens could be called into service again and again. Its allies supplied additional soldiers. Its wealth supported long campaigns. And its political institutions allowed new commanders to take control when older ones failed. Hannibal had discovered these strengths during the Second Punic War. He could defeat one Roman army. He could defeat another. But every time Rome raised another. This made the conflict increasingly difficult for Carthage. Hannibal's army slowly lost experienced soldiers. His allies were uncertain. Carthage itself was far away. Meanwhile, Rome continued attacking Carthaginian interests in Spain and elsewhere. The war became a contest between brilliance and endurance. Hannibal represented brilliance. Rome represented endurance. In the end, endurance won. But Rome's victory came at an enormous cost. The Republic had lost huge numbers of soldiers. Italian farmland had been devastated in many regions. Communities had been destroyed. Families had lost fathers and sons. The war had changed Roman society. It also changed how Rome viewed the world. The Romans became more determined to prevent another Hannibal from ever threatening Italy. They expanded their military presence and strengthened their influence over former Carthaginian territories. The Mediterranean increasingly became a Roman sphere of power. And yet, despite all of this, Hannibal's reputation never disappeared. Generals centuries later still studied his campaigns. Military academies eventually analyzed Cannae as an example of battlefield encirclement. His ability to use a smaller army against a larger one became legendary. Even his decision to cross the Alps became a symbol of extraordinary ambition. Hannibal had failed to conquer Rome, but he had achieved something almost as remarkable. He had forced Rome to change. He had shown the Republic its weaknesses, and by surviving him, Rome became stronger than it had been before. The conflict between Hannibal and Rome therefore shaped both sides. Carthage would disappear. Rome would rise. But Hannibal's name would remain forever connected to the moment when Rome nearly fell. After the destruction of Carthage, the Mediterranean entered a new era. Rome no longer had to fear another Carthaginian army crossing into Italy. But the memory of Hannibal remained deeply embedded in Roman history. Roman politicians often used the story of Hannibal as a warning. A powerful enemy could appear suddenly. A successful commander could exploit Roman weaknesses, and even a seemingly unstoppable army could be defeated if it became careless. For generations, Roman commanders studied the battles of the Second Punic War. They remembered how Hannibal had used terrain at Trebia. They remembered the deadly ambush at Lake Trasimene. And above all, they remembered Cannae. Cannae became one of the clearest examples of tactical encirclement in ancient warfare. Hannibal had placed his troops in a formation that encouraged the Romans to advance. As the Roman center pushed forward, the Carthaginian line curved around them. Then the stronger troops on the sides moved inward. Finally, cavalry attacked from behind. The Roman army was surrounded. It was a devastating demonstration of planning and timing. But Hannibal's greatest achievement was not simply winning the battle. It was understanding what the Roman commanders believed they were seeing. They thought Hannibal was retreating. In reality, he was drawing them into a trap. This ability to manipulate an enemy's expectations made him extraordinary. Yet the same war showed that tactical brilliance had limits. Hannibal could control a battlefield. He could not control Roman politics. He could not control Carthaginian reinforcements. He could not control how long the war would last. And he could not force Rome to accept defeat. Eventually, the strategic balance turned against him. Scipio brought the war to Africa. Hannibal returned to defend Carthage. Zama ended his campaign, but the legend survived. Long after the final walls of Carthage fell, people continued telling stories about the commander who had crossed the Alps with elephants and brought Rome to the edge of disaster. Hannibal had lost an empire, but he had won immortality in history. The story of Hannibal was now becoming a legend. Carthage had vanished, but Rome continued to grow. The Republic expanded across the Mediterranean, and eventually its influence would stretch from Britain to Egypt. Yet the memory of the Second Punic War remained. Roman historians continued recording the conflict because it had been one of the greatest tests Rome ever faced. They remembered Hannibal as a dangerous enemy, but also as an extraordinary commander. His victories became examples of how intelligence could overcome numbers. His defeat became an example of how a nation could survive even its darkest moments. For Hannibal himself, the war had begun as a struggle between Carthage and Rome, but it became a personal journey that lasted most of his life. He had followed the path begun by his father. He had crossed mountains. He had fought in foreign lands. He had watched friends and soldiers die. He had won battles that seemed impossible. And eventually, he had returned home only to find that the war was already lost. His final years were spent far from Carthage. He lived as an exile, moving from one ruler to another. Rome continued to fear him even when he was old. That tells us something about the impression he had left behind. A commander who had once destroyed entire Roman armies remained a symbol of danger long after his military power disappeared. Eventually, Hannibal died. His exact final moments are uncertain, but his life had reached its end. The man was gone. The rivalry between Carthage and Rome was also gone. But the lessons remained. Hannibal showed that courage without strategy was not enough. Rome showed that strategy without endurance could also fail. The Second Punic War became a story of two different kinds of power. One side had an extraordinary commander. The other had an extraordinary state. In the end, Rome survived. But it survived only after facing one of the greatest military minds the ancient world had ever produced. And that is why, more than 2,000 years later, Hannibal Barca is still remembered. Hannibal Barca's story finally comes to an end, but the impact of his life did not. He was born into a world dominated by the rivalry between Carthage and Rome. His father had taught him to distrust Rome, and Hannibal carried that determination throughout his life. When he became commander, he transformed that hatred into action. He crossed the Alps with an army and elephants. He defeated Roman armies at Trebia and Lake Trasimene. At Cannae, he achieved one of the most remarkable victories in ancient military history. For years, Rome feared that Hannibal might destroy the Republic. But Rome refused to surrender, changed its strategy. It rebuilt its armies. It attacked Hannibal's allies. And eventually it brought the war back to Africa. At Zama, Hannibal was defeated by Scipio Africanus. Carthage lost its independence and much of its power. Years later, Rome destroyed Carthage completely. The city disappeared, but Hannibal's name survived. His story became a lesson in military strategy, leadership, endurance, and ambition. He demonstrated that a smaller army could defeat a much larger force through intelligence and planning. But his life also demonstrated something equally important. Winning battles does not always mean winning wars. Hannibal won some of the greatest battles of the ancient world. Rome won the conflict because it could survive defeat longer than Carthage could sustain victory. That is what makes the story of Hannibal so fascinating. He was not simply a hero or a villain. He was a brilliant commander caught inside a struggle between two powerful civilizations. His journey began with a promise made against Rome. It ended in exile, far from the city he had fought to protect. Yet his legacy traveled farther than any army he commanded. The Alps still stand, the ruins of Carthage still remain, and the battlefield of Cannae is still remembered. More than 2,000 years later, the name Hannibal Barca continues to represent one of history's most daring commanders. Rome survived, Carthage fell, but Hannibal became immortal in history,